Hi folks, with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to look at what was the high watermark, what was the high point of a reliable, truthful, accurate media class, the curators of the information that we saw every day. At what point could we say, well, gee whiz, we could rely on that if this newspaper or media outlet says it or prints it, then that is the truth, and we can that is bankable. You can take that to the bank. It's so accurate. Now, compared to today, anything that went on before in the media circus or the media landscape could be seen as more reliable than we have at the moment. And I'm speaking of the mainstream media here, not the gazillion channels you might find on YouTube. But I would perceive that the media classes that existed, the fourth estate, as it's generically called, were the custodians of truth and fact and this truth to power and all that nonsense, which is a popular phrase today, particularly from organisations that tell nothing but lies. But following World War II, and World War II being an extension of the Great Depression, which shaped many minds and shaped many attitudes on the politics to come, and as capitalism was seen as having failed, which then spawned, the various communist sort of and socialist type societies, indeed the sort of fascism that Hitler and the National Socialists practiced in Germany. But if capitalism was reworked and made gentler and fairer and more stable, this sort of thing, then it would be a better society for all. And we saw this particularly being embraced by the FDR administration in the United States, which many parts of which were continued on by the Truman administration, indeed even continued on in many ways by the 8 years of Republican government with Dwight Eisenhower as president in the United States. And also you saw in Britain, particularly with the Labour Party and Clement Attlee that came to government just at the end of World War II. People expected Churchill to win easily, being the wartime leader and all that sort of thing in Britain, but the Labour Party won by a decent margin, by the way, and they were instituting many socialist policies such as national ownership and so on. But in this wider sphere of the social contract with the people, and this is important to sort of see as a centerpiece, within that social contract, the mainstream media, and bear in mind there was no internet or anything in those days, the mainstream media had a social contract with the people that we will tell you the truth. Now, that doesn't mean they weren't the fringe junk newspapers and so on where aliens from Mars came and anally probed me. So there were still those there, but everyone knew that they were on the fringe. Also, there were fringe. Well, I wouldn't call them fringe necessarily, but things like, say, the Reader's Digest books, and they would have sections in them called Mere Mail, where women would write in and say how stupid their husbands were, and this would be printed up. But even though it was, deriding the husband, it was still done in an affectionate way. He's an idiot, but I still love him. Done in that sense. But the mainstream media, the mass consumption, and this would include. Certainly in the 1950s, as television became more widespread, radio, of course, was already around at the time, and the mass distribution of newspapers. Now, the price of newspapers meant that, and the main source of income for news outlets was advertising, but the newspapers were available at a very affordable price, so that any working man could afford a newspaper, and it was quite standard that the working, the guy would come out of the factory and buy the newspaper on the way out, and there'd be a little newsstand at the factory gate, and they'd buy the newspaper and would say read it on the bus or the train or whatever, or read it in the evening. And they also included the newspaper things, of course, like sports or I don't know, horse race betting, things like that. But even if you go back to, say, I remember this, reading newspapers as a kid at school, if you had an assignment or something like that. And if I go back to you can do it online now, look at newspapers from the 1970s and 80s, and it's difficult to find. I'm sure if you went there'd always be an editorial page where people with interesting ideas would let rip. There was always that. But if it was the news, underwritten, if you like, by the newspaper, and it was clear that they all wanted to be, or perceived to be, the journal of record, as it was called. If we say it, it is factually true. It is bulletproof, factually bulletproof. And so now, kids, people I was at school with, and that sort of thing, and the college crowd, there were some of them went on to do journalism, and as I've mentioned in other videos, this guy went to work for a very, very prestigious broadsheet newspaper in the day. And as a cadet journalist, they give you, very basic jobs like covering a dog judging show, or some politician's wife who's going to be doing a cake judging show, or something like that. And they would send the cadet journalists out to cover things like that, and eventually move them up the food chain as they got more experienced. And this guy, he used to, we'd meet for a beer or something like that and catch up, and he'd be there with his cadet journalist buddies and so on. And they used to say how they got really hauled over the coals and beat up by the editors if they fucked up even the tiniest factual thing that wasn't, you'd say, well, that's not really relevant. I mean, who cares? They were judging, and again, I've mentioned this previously, judging a dog show. Instead of the winner of the dog show was a King Charles Spaniel, but it was actually a Cavalier King Charles Spaniel, which is I think a slightly different breed, or slightly smaller or bigger or something like that. I'm not sure I understand the difference, but that difference which was such a minor thing. I mean, who would give a shit? But that was enough for him to get beat up over. We are a journal of record. We are a journal of record, and you can't fuck up on even the tiniest little fact. That's how determined they were at the time to be factually true. They wouldn't be making up stuff like Trump said this or Trump did that, or just because they didn't like somebody, they'd be cast in negative light. It was difficult to find any example or any trace of ideology in these journalists, and certainly in the managerials, the editors and the like. Another one he did, it was the cake that won the thing was an orange cake, but he neglected to mention that it had, I don't know, caraway seeds or poppy seeds or something on it. And that was, again, he got beat up over that. He got the orange cake part right, and he got who won it right, where it was. He got all the facts right, but he missed out the poppy seeds. And that was enough for him to, again, get beat up by the editor. And it was a public beating up, in the meeting there and around the room. Hey, Billy Bob, you fucked up on that story. You had poppy seeds and you didn't say it. That's not good enough. That is below the standard that we agree. The public want facts, and we supply facts. And if we say it, it's true. We are a journal of record. And this was drummed into them. And the other cadet journalists were the same. They'd been similarly beat up over some minor. I'm trying to remember. One of them was telling me about it, and it was a factory. Say it was a factory, and the access to the factory main gate was through Smith Street. But the guy had put in through Jones Street, which was the street on the other side of the factory, but not the street where you would gain access. And he got beat up over that. Now again, a minor detail. He got the street right. He just got where the front door was wrong. But these were the sort of standards that the newspapers had back in the day, and it was a duty that the newspapers had, a social contract, an obligation to inform the public reliably. Now, this had come from I guess there are a few things, the social contract issue, but there was a lot of concern about the propaganda that, say, the Nazi regime and the communist regimes around the world were pumping out, the terrible lies that they were telling. And all the information sources in, say, the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe or China or wherever, all the information sources were controlled by the government, and they were curated simply to justify the government policy or government behaviour or government action. So, and there was a model and a method of delivery that they used to use. So the government was building a new factory or building a new dam or doing this or doing that. They would always say, well, we call them the experts, the independent experts, and the experts say, it's not us, it's not us, we're not saying it, the experts are saying it. And of course, the experts were completely owned by the government. Now, that model of information delivery, of course, it became ubiquitous in the West in later years. But at the time, it was frowned upon, and it was always talked about. Look at the lies that those communists tell. Look at the propaganda of Goebbels. And by the way, Goebbels, although he's lauded as being the propaganda, the doyen of propaganda in the world, Goebbels was actually quite tame compared to the communist propaganda. Goebbels was a 5 out of 10 compared to the communist 10 out of 10. Fairly tame in the overall scheme of things. During the wartime, there'd been a lot of information control by Western governments in Britain and the United States, and the Fourth Estate, the media estate, which was owned, there was no concentration of ownership. It was quite widely dispersed amongst groups where the news was their focus, and this didn't go down. They didn't like being told what to say, what not to say, and particularly being told to tell lies. There was something in the Christian ethic about telling lies that seemed to grate against. Not that these people wouldn't or couldn't or never did, by the way, but there was something in there as well that was baked into that wider social contract pie. So when the war ended, World War II ended, there was this thing of, well, it's about time we started telling the truth, and so gradually, as the years went by, it didn't happen suddenly with a push of a button. There was this focus on accuracy, truth, factual accuracy. And if you couldn't sort of guarantee it, the newspapers actually wouldn't run stories. Well, we don't know the facts, so we'll just wait until more facts, and then or they would mention things in a roundabout way, would then say, look, we don't know here, but we think this might be an issue of concern to the citizenry. So now this was a very important part of the social contract, a media that they had the power to fully curate the news and the information that we as the public saw. And then they gave that guarantee in turn to say, we will only tell you the truth, we'll only give you accurate information. Now, the news and infotainment, if you want to call it that, became commercialized in the United States. And as advertising revenue dollars were key, that's how these news organizations stayed in business, advertising. And so they bringing in advertisers. So they would then switch around to a model that involved bringing eyeballs to the screen. Now, if that involved a bit of sensationalization, it involved a little bit of ginning up, it involved a little bit of dramatizing, then that was kind of seen as okay. So the line began to blur and to move away from factual accuracy to, well, it was kind of accurate, we didn't tell outright lies, and then you started to see stories that only included one side of the story. For example, there was one of the left-wing media outlets today. I was looking at one of the pieces. They've got an attack on one of Trump's policies, and so they only interview people who are radical activists and anti-Trumpers. They only interview them and then quote them. They don't quote the other side of people who say, no, this is quite a sensible policy because they don't do that. Now, those are sort of things that you wouldn't see in the past. So if I get out the microfiche or go online or whatever it might be to look at newspapers from 50 years ago, you see factual accuracy. There were sensational stories, so rumors that Elvis Presley this or the, so you did see that type of stuff. But when it came to government policy, these sorts of things, it matters that were needed to be factually understood, then the level of factual accuracy, you wouldn't find a piece about, even if there's a politician where a poll says this politician is disliked by 70% of the vote, for example, even assuming that's accurate, and I think it would have been back in the day. But then they would have, for example, 5 people would say, yeah, he's a rotten, no good so-and-so. But then 5 people would say, no, that politician actually is doing a good job and is being, very principled about a difficult matter and these sorts of things. So you would get the balance in there. And that's something, of course, that's completely gone. Every hit piece against Trump is just one-sided. There is no attempt at balance, not even the slightest attempt. Now, in a real news environment, you wouldn't get that. There would be balance and there would be facts. So I would argue that the media, we went through a golden age of media following World War II, where because of the war, the Great Depression, and the presumed social contract at many other levels, as well as media reporting, meant that we had maybe 30 years, perhaps a little bit more, but somewhere in that, we had a reliable, dependable, factual, accurate news source that was curated by the main news organisations. Rupert Murdoch, who saw news as entertainment, for example, and started getting into movie making as well as news production, and sort of fused the idea of infotainment. He was also a prime mover, I think, in shifting the news away from factual, accurate delivery of information into being part of a wider entertainment, and that puts people under a lot of pressure. The editors and the various people working in the organisation to say, how do we bring eyeballs? Well, the facts and the dry facts and reporting, that's not going to bring eyeballs. I got to double the amount of eyeballs. That's my budget. That's my KPI. Okay, we've got a lot of stories running about man bites dog, and then that blurred lines also along there. So there was a natural gravitational pull away from facts that are fairly dry. And the idea of we're the journal of record, you can bank on us as to tell you the absolute factual truth. That started to lose its currency. That became something that people just accepted and said, okay, well, you guys are supposed to tell the truth anyway, so what's the big deal? And then we didn't realize how it was drifting away from truth, because the currency and the value of truth appeared to be less valuable than it once was. Now, I first noticed the drift away from truth, and I'd suspected of some. I started to see, the feminist thing was fairly big in the 70s, and even as a schoolboy, reading newspapers and through college into, going into the workplace and so on, I noticed there were stories that just didn't seem to ring true. They just didn't. For example, claims that in the feminist propaganda was that all women are being oppressed and beaten by their husbands and boyfriends, and there's this patriarchy and misogyny and so on. These stories were starting to circulate, as I remember, in the late 70s into the 80s, and they were quoting statistics, and they would say Professor such and such. Now, they didn't say that Professor such and such was a radical feminist lesbian academic, and they should have said that. They didn't say that the study that supposedly proved this terrible patriarchy was conducted by a group of radical activist Marxist, lesbians who'd been given affirmative action jobs in a university and so on. So they didn't say those things. So when I looked at them, I thought, this doesn't seem to ring true. If it's as widespread as they say, I would know people who'd been, I'd have come across this, and especially as they hinted or suggested or implied that it was more a working and lower middle class thing initially. They switched it around to, years later to be it was only middle class straight white men that did it, and no one else. But again, that it gives away the ideological bent of the whole exercise. So, but what really nailed it for me was when I started business traveling, and I would have, because I was moving through a lot of time zones quickly, I would be in Los Angeles, New York, and then London, all in the same 24-hour period. And so as often, because the cleaning of the housekeeping in the airplanes then was not so good, and so there would still be newspapers left in the seat pockets of the airplane. So I'd have the Los Angeles, the New York, and the London newspapers all within the same 24-hour period to read. And I noticed exactly the same article. So an article would say that 50% of all women are oppressed by evil men, and that would be the article in Los Angeles, and it would quote a local Los Angeles academic from California University, Berkeley or something, and they'd have exactly, I'd say 50% of women are being beaten to death. Then exactly the same article, exactly word for word, the same article in the New York newspaper, but they would just say it was a New York academic that had said it. And then exactly the same, word for word, exactly the same article in the London newspaper, but they would say a British academic had said it, and saying that a British study. That's when I realized fully that the media was delivering internationally curated ideological propaganda rather than reporting any facts. And that was in, I suppose, I don't know, the early 80s, mid 80s maybe, around then. And that's when I had it nailed. So the drift away from facts began then. It began on various fronts. First, it began on feminist issues. Then it moved into race issues and so on and so forth. So, and all the international media responded simultaneously and on cue, all using the same talking points. So already you could see there was a central control of the media, and all these international media outlets were going along with this. So at that point, the propaganda already came in. Now, it didn't come in straight away that everything became propaganda on day one, but it crept in, and I noticed it again conclusively from those times to the point where everything we see now is propaganda. Now, there was a convention in, I think it was Britain, talking about the media recently, and some were claiming, well, okay, CNN, MSNBC, and CBS, all those, the BBC in Britain, ABC in Australia, they're all pumping out propaganda, which they are, by the way, pumping out hysterical pro-globalist type propaganda, and you struggle. The only factual stories you see are ones where they can't apply the ideological prism to it, or they're not interested in applying the ideological prism. It's only those stories that are going to be factual. The rest will all be hysterical propaganda nonsense. But the claim was that, well, okay, all these outfits, they do pump out propaganda, but compared to the individual people doing videos in their kitchen tables or lounge rooms or something on YouTube, then it's still a better quality of news overall than you get from many of the independent operators. And some sort of said, well, look, the facts that MSNBC deliver are still better than what you see on Joe Rogan. Well, not on a story for story basis. I don't believe that. Now, Joe Rogan makes no, he doesn't say, look, I'm a factual news organization. He has discussions with various interesting people, and some of them go for a while. And some of the things that are said are opinions, and they're very clearly stated as much. Whereas MSNBC, for example, or CNN, they say these are the facts. We have the morally superior position and they don't, and they're not delivering facts. But Rogan makes no, as I understand it anyway, makes no bones about it. He's not delivering some factual date, time, and place type news article. Far from it. He's having discussions with people. Some of the stuff that are mentioned you may disagree with, but it's just generally an opinion piece. Now, if CNN said, "Look, this is just an opinion piece. We hate Trump, so we're just going to make up terrible things and tell terrible lies about him," and here we go. If they did that, it'd be different. But they try and present it as fact, and that's the difference. Now, when the news was a highly trusted, the news outlets were highly trusted at the time. Now, you can say they weren't perfect, and they weren't, by the way, but the news outlets were very much trusted, and or compared to today at least, were trusted, and that trust was used by the globalist machine. So the globalist machine was looking at, where do people in the West trust? What do they trust the most? Well, they trust their institutions. They trust the news. Okay, well, let's corrupt in that. We'll corrupt that, because while they have this high level of trust, we can tell lies, we can deceive them, we can engage in all sorts of treachery in terms of information delivery. But because these people trust these institutions so much, the news outlets, then we can spend decades deceiving them, and we can do it insidiously without them knowing. And so I would argue that period after World War II was the high watermark. That's when the curators and the deliverers of information, the mainstream, took it very seriously. They took that responsibility, the social contract, to be journalism record, very seriously, and then they stopped doing that. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.